Okay, hello everybody. It's very nice to meet all of you. My name is Lucy Glasspool and I am from Nagoya University of Foreign Studies. And my area of research is gender, sexuality and fan cultures. So I'm sure a lot of you are fans of something. I'm sure a lot of you have expertise in some kind of Japanese or other Asian studies. So I'm really looking forward to your insights after I finish talking. And if I speak too fast, please tell me immediately, because when I get excited, and I am a fan, so I get excited, I talk very fast, all right? So just stop me if it's too much. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about mostly gender, but also some ambiguity related to sexual orientation in the cosplay community. I'll be talking mainly about Japan, but because the cosplay community is very much becoming transnational, I'll also be bringing in examples from Asia and beyond. Alright, so what am I going to talk about today? So first of all, some of you, if you're not that familiar with cosplay, I'll contextualize it a little bit inside and outside Japan. I'm not going to go too deep. Then, one of the key aspects of cosplay is fandom and cosplay as a fan practice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. What does it mean to be a fan of cosplay in particular, and how could that inform issues of gender and sexuality? Then we'll get into gender, and I'm going to, if I have time, talk about two types of cosplay that play specifically with gender. And then we'll look a little bit at sexuality in connecting cosplay with other areas of fandom. In particular, I'm going to talk about boys' love, which Professor Nozawa will be giving you a much more detailed overview of in her presentation. And conclusion. I might run out of time before that, I usually do, but we'll see. Okay, so, has anybody not heard of cosplay before? Good. Alright, has anybody done cosplay? Brilliant. Yeah? Has anybody done dressing up for Halloween? Yeah, okay, great. So, dressing up is common in basically every culture that celebrates Halloween and many other activities. And dressing up for Halloween is included in the Japanese definition of cosplay, but cosplay itself is a much more complicated practice. So, let's have a look. So cosplay is a really complex phenomenon, and it involves not only dressing up, but also performance, production of media, and kind of sharing with many other aspects of fandom. And we'll have a look at how complex it is a little bit in a minute. And as I mentioned, I keep mentioning, it's connected intimately with fandom. So cosplay, as the cosplay community knows it, is more than dressing up as a character. And this is quite timely for my topic and Professor Nozawa's topic, because on February 15th, it was International Fandom Day, International Fanworks Day, when people celebrate being a fan all around the world. So it's a good month to do this in. And cosplay as a fan, part of fandom, is quite interesting because more than other types of fandom, it mixes embodied practice. Like, the body is really key to this mode of fandom, with digital texts. And the way it does that can kind of play with, you can play with gender a lot within that. And as I mentioned, it's become a transnational mode of fandom. So we'll talk a little bit about the origins of cosplay in a minute, but these days, Japanese cosplayers, they kind of share and they look at cosplayers from Spain, from UK, from America, and vice versa. So it has a lot of shared features, but there are still some specific kind of features according to regions and cultures. So at its most basic, cosplay is dressing up as a character, usually from a pop culture text, not always. In Japan, they'll dress as characters from, of course, anime, manga, video games, TV shows, movies, pop stars, even historical characters like famous samurai from the Edo period, and so on. But it involves more than that. So cosplay involves being photographed. So this is a very famous kind of fan comic convention in Tokyo called Comic-Con. Some of you might have heard of it. And cosplayers go there to be seen. So to be seen and to be documented is, for some cosplayers, a very important part of their fan practice. Also, to disseminate, to share images of oneself. So not all cosplayers do this. Some of them just like to dress up and be seen. But some of them like to become their own piece of media. So they are not only copying other media texts, they become a media text. And they share that, and in turn they inspire other works of fandom. So there are all kinds of Japanese and many languages, cosplay websites where people upload their own photographs. Also, key to some cosplayers is live performance, dramatic performance. So this is an event called the World Cosplay Summit. It's held every year in Nagoya, where I am from. So I used to work at this event. And there, not only do they have to make costumes, pose in costumes, be photographed in costumes, but also act as the characters. So performance is a really big part for many cosplayers. So, what about cosplay itself? So as I mentioned, dressing up as characters from various texts is a worldwide fan activity, but the practice that we know as cosplay is recognized by most fans, or at least many fans, as having a Japanese pop culture origin. So even though cosplay, of course, is not limited to dressing as Japanese characters, or characters of Japanese origin, people kind of associate cosplay with Japaneseness, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. On the other hand, some scholars think it might actually have had a Western origin in the 1970s at the early science fiction and fantasy conventions, especially Star Trek and that kind of thing. These were kind of like more like called masquerades, and they were quite small and they were quite private. And Japanese cosplay at the beginning was also quite small and quite private. But it's grown, especially in Japan, into not only a big industry, but also a representative of Japanese pop culture. And yet, at the same time, it still remains, in some ways, quite private. But from those origins, from the 70s up to today, Japanese, other types of Asian and Western cosplay cultures, they've all influenced each other to form today's fandom. Alright. So, what does it mean? What cosplay as Japanese fan practice, or fan practice of Japanese origin? It comes either from the words costume and play smashed together, or, and nobody's quite sure which, costume and roleplay squished together. But given how important performing as the character is in the cosplay world, this costume and roleplay might be the most appropriate or the most accurate. So in Japan, cosplay again began in the 70s to 80s, but it began specifically at fan comic conventions. So it wasn't so much about dressing up purely for the love of a character. In these conventions, people would dress up and stand next to like a booth selling fan comics to draw people in to buying the comics. So it started as an aid to kind of commercializing fandom. But it became so popular and so many people wanted to do it that these days those comic events like Comic-Con have had to separate the cosplayers and put them in their own area because there's so many they're getting in the way of the selling of comics. And so in Japan today, where you can do cosplay and how you can do cosplay is quite strictly demarcated. There are a lot of rules about how, when, and where you can do it. And most of that is about not annoying outsiders. So inside and outside, the inside community and others are quite, hello, they're quite clearly marked. in Japanese cosplay world. So compared to Western cosplay, for example, it's a little bit private, it's really self-regulated. So if any of you have seen or been to a cosplay event in this country or elsewhere in Europe, you know, you can get ready at home. You can put on your elaborate costume and makeup that takes hours, and you can get the train down to the convention or wherever it is, outside, inside. In Japan, generally speaking, that is very much frowned upon. You have to go to the convention, you have to go to a certain room, get changed, do the cosplay in a certain area so as not to annoy other people, then come back, get changed, and go back on public transport looking completely normal. So there are some differences between Japanese and Western cosplay in terms of visibility. But nevertheless, the media and Japanese government have taken cosplay, recognized there is something highly appealing in it, and have started using it to kind of promote Japanese tourism. They're using it to promote the Olympics. And in doing so, they've made cosplay a representative example of Japanese pop culture. So here's a picture of the current Japanese Prime Minister Abe cosplaying as Super Mario in the Rio Olympic handover ceremony when Brazil handed over to Japan. And it was met with mixed reactions, especially from people who really like Mario. But it's kind of cemented this idea that cosplay is a part of Japanese culture. Whereas if you go to Japan, cosplay is actually a fairly niche practice. And it's not something you would see on the streets or in public every day. But even though it has this kind of, maybe it has a Western history, because of this type of media visibility and popularity with fans and how it's been spread worldwide through kind of social media, especially various kind of online technologies, there's become an association worldwide with cosplay and Japaneseness. And not only an association, a value. So Japanese cosplay, especially commercial cosplay companies, when they are selling to cosplayers from outside Japan, they will really highlight the Japaneseness of their product, the Japaneseness of their cosplay, because Japaneseness in the cosplay world has a kind of cultural capital for many fans. And so this is one itself. I think it makes cosplay wigs, and it's called Assist Cosplay Shop from Japan. And it's from, yeah, so it tells you all the time, it's from Japan, it's from Japan. It uses Japanese models because it has a kind of value of high standard cosplay, of originality in cosplay. And this is another one, Japan quality costumes. And so made in Japan, using the word Japan, using Japanese models, using Japanese flags and reviews, etc. They're really supporting, disseminating cosplay to the world and making it a transnational fan practice. But at the same time, they're encouraging fans to invest in the idea of Japan as like the home of cosplay, the cultural heart of cosplay. And so Emerald King, who is an Australian scholar who talks a lot about cosplay and gender, she says that for many cosplayers, its main attraction lies in its Japaneseness. So not necessarily in the dressing up as a character, although of course that's pleasurable as well, but the fact that it's part of the Japanese pop culture that they love. And yeah, I quite understand that. So cosplay events aren't limited, of course, generally to Japanese characters, but even some events in Japan, they will invite people from around the world, like the World Cosplay Summit. It invites teams from 38 countries to compete for like really expensive prizes, but you can only dress as Japanese characters. And the whole idea of coming to Japan to do cosplay is set up as a reward in itself. So again, even kind of international cosplay events, they are, again, setting up the value of Japaneseness. So we can probably agree that Japan is not the be-all and end-all of cosplay, but it's kind of integral to many fans. So let's talk about cosplay and fans. What does it mean? to do good cosplay. So I'm going to talk about two concepts that are key to cosplay and also cause a lot of tension within cosplay, which plays into gender. So a key value of mainstream cosplay is authenticity. If you talk to cosplayers, they bring up this idea all the time. You need to be authentic. Of course, authenticity is subjective. It means something different to everybody. But within the cosplay world, it's seen as loyalty and fidelity. So loyalty to what? Loyalty to the character. So the cosplayer who can get the closest to the so-called original character, who can look the most like them and perform in a way that seems in keeping, that seems similar to the original character, they will be valued as good cosplayers. That also involves making your costume, not buying it. So both skill and loyalty come together to form authenticity. And while this is an important facet of other types of fandom as well, it's particularly visible within cosplay, which is interesting because, by contrast, many fan creations are thought of as transformative. And you might have heard of the phrase transformative work. And that basically means something that somebody has made based on an existing text, and they have done something to change it. They have added something. They have changed it in a particular way that makes something new and really creative. And so the kind of foremost academic journal on fan works is called Transformative Works and Cultures. So transformation and change is seen to be at the heart of so many types of fan practice. But if you are trying to be authentic, how can you be transformative at the same time? And so this causes quite a bit of tension, especially if you're trying to play with gender within your cosplay. So we're going to have a look in some of the ways in which this tension manifests and how it can make a more interesting performance of non-normative gender and how that sometimes gets devalued within the cosplay world. Okay, so why do we do cosplay? You could probably give me a million reasons, but I've just written a few. So, of course, people cosplay to show how much they love a character. And often, if you want to do good cosplay, that's by mimicking it perfectly. To show how well you know that character, to show your knowledge and appreciation for that character. Maybe it's to showcase your costume skills, your makeup skills. So how much kind of time and training you've invested in doing cosplay. There's also a social, highly social element to cosplay, making friends with similar interests at events and also online. And that's a big part of every fandom community. To engage in dramatic performance. Not every cosplayer does this, but for some that is part of the appeal. To make money. So there are professional cosplayers. If any of you go to science fiction or fantasy type conventions, you're probably familiar with like booth babes, who are very conventionally attractive women. They dress as some very popular female character, a very skimpy version, and they stand there. So you can make money as a professional cosplayer. And that is often through erotic cosplay. And this is a very interesting subgenre of cosplay, erotic and pornographic cosplay. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I don't have time. But if you're interested in the gender and sexuality aspect of cosplay, this is a really interesting kind of avenue to go down. And also some people cosplay to make a statement about or play with different aspects of identity. And it's the final two in this list, the erotic aspect and the identity play aspect, that sometimes are viewed as the most problematic within the mainstream cosplay community because they're the most transformative. They change from the original generally the most. And they are also, perhaps not coincidentally, bound up with gender and sexuality the most out of all of these kind of reasons for doing a cosplay. So we'll leave erotic cosplay, and we're going to take a look at some of the more mainstream and niche cosplays that play with gender ambiguity. And we're going to start that by looking at crossplay. And then if we have time, we'll look at trans cosplays. It's very interesting. So a lot of writing about cosplay, in fact, I'd say almost all writing about cosplay takes an interest in its gendered aspects, especially in Japan, because in Japan, the majority of cosplayers are female. There are lots of men as well, but a high percentage of female cosplayers. So it's often discussed in terms of how could cosplay potentially impact specifically female resistance to gender norms. And one of the areas that people talk about a lot is crossplay. And crossplay, in its most basic definition, is cosplaying as a character of the opposite gender to the one that you identify with in your everyday life. So a female cosplayer cosplays as a male character and vice versa. So there's an example. This is a female cosplayer dressing as a male character. Who's a character from Final Fantasy. And this is really popular. Crossplay is a very popular form of cosplay. And especially this way around. Females cosplayers dressing as male characters. And it has a lot of potential in terms of messing with gender norms, but also it has some potential problems as well. So we're going to have a look at what some of those are. Okay, so let's start with looking at female to male crossplay. So we're looking at mainly Japanese cosplay, so let's use the Japanese word. So in Japanese, female to male cross-dressing is known as danso. So that is the kanji for man and the kanji for kind of costume or outfit. And in the cosplay world, this is entirely normalized, not only in Japan, but overseas as well. A female cosplayer playing a male character, nobody is going to look twice at that. It's extremely popular. And this is actually contrary to representations of kind of cross-dressing or transgender in Japanese mainstream media, like Japanese TV shows. And you see a surprising amount of transgender or cross-dressing or other gender play in Japanese TV shows, and I think Professor Nozawa will talk about that a little bit more. But it's almost always male to female. And so that is the kind of general mainstream Japanese idea of what gender switching or this kind of gender play is. But in the cosplay world, it's the other way around. So I was really interested in finding out why that is. Why is it so common in cosplay? And does it actually make a statement about gender norms? Are female cosplayers trying to say something by doing this, or not? So, one of the basic reasons that people give about why there is so much danso, so many female to male crossplays, is there are so many female cosplayers. And there are so many popular male characters. And someone's going to cosplay them. If there's not enough male cosplayers, it equals women will do it. And yeah, this probably is a pretty reasonable explanation, partly, of why there is so much danso in the cosplay world. But there's a lot more culturally specific factors at play around this issue. So it may definitely be the case that the leaning of cosplayers in Japan towards danso probably happens unconsciously. Many people argue they're not really trying to perform a non-normative role, but there are other appeals for them. So in the anime and game world, and if many of you are familiar with the anime, manga, video game world in Japan, there is a fascination with gender ambivalent bodies. Beautiful boys, kind of non-gender specific people, non-humans. So this is really encouraged by and encourages cosplayers to do danso, because this type of character design, this type of ambivalent visual design is really popular in the ACG world. So generally speaking, danso cosplayers, they will choose a beautiful boy character, or bishonen, beautiful boy characters. They won't choose hyper-masculine characters to cosplay. And So here's an example. I'm using a lot of Shingeki no Kyojin because it's really good to illustrate this and it's great. So you get a lot of girls, for example, cosplaying Armin because his original character design facilitates a girl cosplaying him. He's very slender, he has long hair, his mannerisms, they are not like typically, traditionally masculine. And so he's very attractive for many people to cosplay. And this kind of character design, it's been discussed and spread throughout Japanese culture. And this has a long history, which again, Professor Nozawa is going to touch on. But this especially beautiful boy within Japanese visual culture is embedded. And it's becoming more and more mainstream as part of kawaii culture. And kawaii is too complex a phenomenon to really go into now, but it has aspects of cuteness, youth, femininity, vulnerability. And this type of visual is aimed at women in all types of Japanese visual culture. So yeah, it's very appealing to women. And this type of danso and this type of character design, it demonstrates a kind of fluid visual masculinity. It has many aspects that are generally characterized as feminine. But does this mean that danso cosplayers are actually trying to make a comment on gender roles about traditional Japanese masculinity or the role of Japanese women? A lot of researchers say no, they're not. It's about this authenticity of cosplay, because commitment and adherence to the original characters are important. You want to look like the original characters. And female cosplayers are just well suited to playing bishonen, much more than male cosplayers, and much more than kind of macho characters. So there's another one from Attack on Titan. So this type of, he's a very popular character within this fandom. So skinny, short, pale, works very, very well for danso. Okay. So danso cosplay in Japan, it doesn't explicitly comment on women's gender performance. If you talk to Japanese cosplayers or scholars of Japanese cosplay, none of them really say, women are trying to say something about femininity or about the role of women in Japan by doing this. It doesn't even necessarily criticize images of dominant masculinity. It doesn't recreate those images of dominant masculinity. Instead, it's about fantasy of an idealized masculinity. And it's an idealized masculinity that comes from women's fantasies. And as I mentioned before, this is seen in various bishonen images in all kinds of pop culture genres, manga, anime, different music subgenres like idols, visual kei, this kind of thing. You see it time and time again. And also a specific cross-dressing masculinity, which we see in cosplay and also all-female theatre, like Takarazuka, which is like the kind of all-female version of kabuki, but more modern. So this is a Takarazuka version of Rurouni Kenshin, and it's the female actresses who play the male characters have a huge following, and they are seen as much more ideal than a male actor would be. It's a more perfect type, more attractive type of masculinity for many Japanese women than a male actor would be, which is why they are so popular. And this is one on the left, that's a kind of typical boys love shoujo manga type of male character visual. So it's about expressing an alternative, not necessarily a realistic alternative, but an alternative of what masculinity could be and what women would like it to be. But it kind of stays within the realm of fantasy. It's playing with possibilities. It's not making really a political statement. So, nope, not there yet. Okay. So perhaps this kind of gender ambiguity in mainstream danso, and danso is mainstream, it doesn't really have that much of a desire to challenge gender norms, at least in Japan. Outside Japan, perhaps in some cases where fans are a little more locked into gender politics, it might have more of a kind of meaningful intent. Instead of that, it tends to strengthen and popularize a female-centric ideal of masculinity. So that's dancehall. It's pretty standard. Arguably, it's not doing anything extraordinary. What about the other way around? Male to female cross-dressing, which is known as josol. So again, it's woman and costume or outfit. So we might think that given the acceptability and the high cultural capital of the kind of kawaii look, the cute boy look, we might expect to see some really cute boys doing josol flourishing alongside dancehall in the cosplay world. But in Japan and overseas, this is actually pretty rare. And in fact, it's banned at many Japanese cosplay events. So there is no mention of dancehall. So women will go and routinely dress up as male characters. But a lot of rules, especially at smaller events, they will say no dancehall. So why is that? Even though Japanese TV variety shows often feature male to female, transgender, transsexual, or cross-dressers. Oh, my bad. Josol. You're quite right. Yeah, so... God, I was. No, thank you. Alright, so yeah. So why is it so uncommon, josol? And why is dancehall so common? Is it because it's more closely connected with gender identity of the cosplayer or the sexual identity of the cosplayer than dancehall? Or are those kind of ideas put onto the cosplayer by outside eyes? And does this show any sign of changing? Because this has been the case really up to the last few years. But perhaps there's kind of maybe a softening of the attitude towards josol. So again, we can start with start with demographics. There are not so many male cosplayers, therefore there are not so many josol performances to be seen. But it's more than that. Talking to researchers and cosplayers, and this is not only in Japan, this is worldwide, the dominant gender norms in society that surround what is appropriate clothing and what is appropriate kind of beauty regimes for a man seem to assert a much greater influence on josol cosplayers than dancehall cosplayers. And when we think about the everyday world around us, this is not so surprising. Like, any girl can wear trousers, she can have a cropped haircut, she doesn't have to wear makeup, necessarily. Well, that causes, there's a whole debate around that as well. But yeah, nobody will look twice. But if a man wears a skirt as, I can't remember his name, but somebody just wore one to the Oscars and it was fantastic. Right? Anyway, so that is going to cause a stir. And for some people, that's great. But for others, especially in Japan, maybe that kind of visibility and that kind of standing out makes them feel very self-conscious. And one of the reasons for that is there is still in Japan and many other Asian countries, and not only Asian countries, there's still a kind of false equivalency for many people that if you cross-dress, you must be gay. So your gender performance is inextricably connected to your sexual orientation. And as we know, it is much more complicated than that. It is not an equivalency at all, but it still exists among many people. And so there is kind of a concern among male cosplayers that if they do josol, then their sexuality might be called into question. Why is that a problem? Because there is still a lot of discrimination against LGBTQ, at least outside the entertainment industry. So many Japanese people are actually very accepting of LGBTQ. They see them on TV all the time, especially transgender. But when we look at statistics, they feel much less comfortable if they are in a kind of shared everyday space with them. So to actually meet to meet one of your friends and find out that he is dressing as a woman. This causes a lot of concern for male cosplayers, especially in Japan. So this is given as one of the main reasons why there is not so much freedom to do joso, even though a lot of male cosplayers might like to do it. And so when people do joso, they tend to do it in a very specific way that distances them from accusations about their sexual orientation. And especially until recent years, joso was more about comedy. And not only cosplayers do this, but Halloween, you'll see loads of guys dressed in like a sexy maid outfit or something like that. And he's got a beard, this kind of thing. It's about comedy. It's not about passing as typically feminine, or it's not about authenticity. So let's have a look at a couple of examples. So we can see some passing cosplay. There's a nice male cosplayer doing Hatsune Miku. And here is a commercial cosplay company for men's and women's examples of the same outfit. So it's a little bit far away to see, but you can probably see that the male cosplayer, he's not really trying to pass. So he hasn't shaved his legs. He's got a very typically masculine build. He's not wearing makeup. He looks funny. So he'd be dressing like this for a laugh. This is not only inside Japan, we can see it outside in Western cosplay as well. So here's a nice passing cosplay, Sailor Moon. And here's quite a well-known cosplayer doing a non-passing Sailor Neptune from Sailor Moon. So this is much more common to see than this version. I had to search quite hard to find a passing joso cosplay in the West. So if you retain the traditional masculine gender markers, if you retain your muscles, your beard, your leg hair, you don't wear makeup, it makes the crossplay safe in regard to discussion of your sexual orientation and your masculinity. It makes it funny, but it also makes it extra playful. And some people argue that this actually makes comedic joso potentially more transgressive of normative gender than danso or passing joso. So within the cosplay world, this type of comedy joso, it's not really concerned with authenticity. It's more about transformation. It's transforming the character far away from the original, while still kind of showing affection for it, even if it's really like a playful and humorous affection. This makes it kind of devalued within the mainstream cosplay world. It's like, you're not taking this seriously, are you? So it has low cultural capital. But at the same time, it declines to engage seriously with the normative binaries of gender and sexuality. So you're dressing as a female character, but you don't have to go all the way to sit on the feminine side of the fence. You can dress as a female character, you can love a female character, and you can still retain masculine gender markers. Why should you have to fit completely onto one side or the other? So, compared to dancehall cosplayers who are really trying to stick to the rules of the community in terms of authenticity, and so are very highly valued and popular, these joso cosplayers, they're very irreverent. They are not trying to be serious about their gender performance. And so they kind of have the possibility of highlighting the kind of constructed nature or the problematic nature of these gender norms. That if you are going to be a woman or perform as a woman, it must be a feminine performance. And so even though within the community they don't really get a lot of credibility, they kind of are the most subversive of all of the crossplays. However, there is a group of cosplayers who view this type of crossplay, and in fact all crossplay, as being quite problematic And that is because it clashes with their own intent and their own meaning making in cosplay. So we're going to take a look at another type of cosplay that is deeply involved with gender performance, and in which the practice is very, very meaningful and deeply connected with their identity, and that is trans cosplay. So compared to crossplay, standard crossplay, dancehall, which is completely normalized and very popular, trans cosplay is a tiny minority of the cosplay world. I don't have any percentages, but I'm going to say probably less than 1%. Nevertheless, it's so meaningful to them that I find it really interesting to look into. So it's not very visible in Japanese or overseas communities, but they do exist. And some of the reasons for them not being visible are related to crossplay, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. But it's very important to its practitioners. And trans cosplay is self-defined by the communities themselves, trans cosplay communities, as cosplayers who are transgender, transsexual, or another form of gender variant. And this is, they feel, deeply part of their identity. And cosplay has a very important function in expressing their identity. So, in Japan, there's a few who have kind of gone public about their transness and their fandom. So lately, in February, there was an article in Yahoo Japan News in Japanese about a trans cosplayer named Hiromi, and she said that she wasn't that interested in cosplay to begin with, but once she had begun and started realizing she could wear these very feminine costumes, she said it made her feel natural in a way that her everyday life had not allowed her to do. And there's a few Western trans cosplay communities on DeviantArt, Instagram, this kind of thing, and they split their, you can upload your photos, they split it into male to female, female to male, gender variant, and it's kind of, they advertise themselves as a safe space for expressing your true identity. Don't know why that red line's there, ignore that. So, what's the difference then between crossplay and trans cosplay? For crossplayers, their performance, their gender performance or their sexual performance is fluid, it's playful, it is cosplay. It's not integral to their identity. Maybe they are experimenting a little with going outside their identity or trying to figure out what their identity might be, but yeah, it's very much playful. But trans cosplayers, they're not playing. They're not playing with gender, they're not playing in their cosplay practice. Cosplay is a space where they can express their true selves. And so this is not fluid at all in terms of gender performance. So this is the advertising spiel from TG Cosplay, which is another trans cosplay community. They say it's a haven for transgendered cosplayers. For those of us who want our true inner gender to be acknowledged, based on the gender of the characters we portray with costume. So when a trans cosplayer who's biologically male but identifies as female, when they cosplay a female character, that is not crossplay. They are showing their true inner identity. And it gives them an opportunity to do that they might not have in the everyday world. So it's a space apart from everyday life for them. And they can present their true gender to society, and hopefully they can be understood. But unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that, many of them find. Even though for them cosplay is potentially a utopia, they are hampered in getting their message across that this is who I really am. This is my true inner self. And this is very essentialist kind of view. They are not trying to break down gender binaries. They are not trying to play with fluidity. Even though their biological self is on the opposite side from who they truly feel they are, they don't want to knock down that wall. They want to cross over onto the other side so they can sit neatly within a gender binary. So they're not trying to do anything transgressive. They're just trying to live as themselves. But this is made quite difficult for them, and one of the problems that they articulate in these communities is crossplay. Crossplay is a big barrier. And its popularity and its playfulness defeats their serious mission connected with identity. So one of the problems they have is with dancehall, dressing as a man. So because dancehall cosplayers are so popular and it is so normalized within the cosplay world, they're concerned that, especially female to male trans cosplayers, they're worried that when they dress as a male character, people won't understand that they are trying to express their identity. People think, oh, it's another cosplay. Oh, wow, she's doing a really good job. Not understanding that that person's identity is not she, it is he, and they are trying to express that through cosplay. So everybody kind of gets lumped in with dancehall cosplayers. And because the trans cosplay community is so kind of small and has such a small voice, it's difficult to kind of make other people aware of this. On the other hand, there is jostle. And again, this is centered on the issue that crossplay is playful. And especially jostle, the comedy jostle is so playful. And they are saying, you're not taking this seriously. So, male to female trans cosplayers, they see really comedic kind of cross-dressing within crossplay, and people are laughing, and people think it's a joke. People appreciate it as a joke. But for trans cosplayers, it's not a joke. It needs to be taken seriously. So the kind of the comedic nature of it is detracting from the goals of these trans cosplayers. It's kind of hurting their feelings and hurting their mission. And this kind of raises a key question about what is cosplay for? Is it really about play? Is the fundamental nature of cosplay play? Is it playing with gender? Is it showing that gender is not fixed or essential? Or is it something that is essential? Is it something that is serious business? Is it something that can show who you truly are, even if it is temporary, even if it is outside the everyday world? So, cosplay, we can see it in many different ways. It can be seen as an act of fanish devotion, and that can come out in play, in gender play, in dancehall. But it can also be a gender statement of the utmost personal and political significance. But at the moment, that seems to be a really kind of minority view about cosplay. So there's a lot of interesting ways in which gender plays out within this kind of crossing over within cosplay. And it can be made even more complicated by crossing over between modes of fandom, between cosplay and other types of fan practice and fan media. So, for my almost final section, we're going to talk a little bit about how sexual ambiguity influences and is influenced by the previous kind of gender fluidity and gender ambiguity we've been looking at. So, I found in my own research, my doctoral research was about Final Fantasy VII and different types of fan practices around it. I found that it's almost impossible to look at one mode of fandom in isolation. It's really difficult to look just at cosplay in isolation, or fan videos like Machinima in isolation, or fan comics, because they all interconnect in some way. So it's really useful to look at how do these connect and how does this make issues of identity more complex within the kind of fandom, within the fan world. So cosplay is influenced, of course cosplay is influenced by manga, by anime, by games, dramas, movies, all of these many things. But it's also influenced by fan works, it's influenced by transformative works. So fans play a really big influence on changing the cosplay world itself. And in Japan, not only Japan, but a lot in Japan, cosplay practitioners are often fans of a genre of manga, anime, and fan comics known as boys' love, which is the topic of Professor Nozawa's presentation, so I'm not going to spend too much time explaining what it is. Probably a lot of you have heard of it anyway. Okay, so we're going to take a look at how the interconnections between boys' love fandom and cosplay really can raise issues of complicating sexual ambiguity as well as gender ambiguity. Alright, so what can we say about boys' love? Alright, briefly defining it, some of you might know it as BL, some people might know it as yaoi, some people as shonenai, that's kind of an old one. But it's a genre, a multimedia genre that is basically about romantic or sexual relationships between two male characters. And there's original stories, so original boys' love manga, original boys' love anime, and fan creations based on like other original texts. For example, like Attack on Titan fan comics, or One Piece boys' love fan comics, this type of thing. And in the West, we don't exactly have boys' love, but we have slash. So actually, there's a very fascinating to compare the two, but we can't do that, we don't have time. But yeah, there's a lot of differences between the two, but that's to do with politics as well. Okay, so within boys' love, Japanese boys' love, also the Korean version, the Chinese version as well, boys' love media tend to typify, to really replicate the gender ambiguity, and especially the bishonen visuals within Japanese female-oriented culture. So this is one of the first boys' love original manga, Kaze Toki no Uta, from the 70s. And you can see that the male characters are very willowy, kind of feminine-looking, slender. And the one on the right, this is a fan comic, a doujinshi, based on a boys' anime, Yu Yu Hakusho, from the 1990s. And it changes the characters to make them look much more slender and kind of delicate and beautiful. And you'll find this in boys' love of whatever the original is. So even if the original, they are quite buff. When you put them into boys' love, often they will become, kind of like this. So as we said, this kind of becomes an ideal of masculinity, or at least of a fantasy masculinity for some women in Japan, East Asia, and beyond. And I'm not really going to go into what are the various appeals, why do women like boys' love here, because I'll get too enthusiastic. But it's enough to say that in Japan, they are popular with a lot of cosplayers, both as an accessible type of masculinity, an appealing type of masculinity, and an attainable look to cosplay. So it's much more easy for a female cosplayer to dress as a BL character than the original kind of like hyper macho character. So there's lots of permutations, lots of different ways in which BL plays out within cosplay scenarios. So you get a lot of cosplaying original boys' love text, that is manga that were originally written as boys' love. This one's quite a popular one, it was a few years ago, Junjo Romantica. So you get a lot of people cosplaying those characters. Or you can get people who are inspired by boys' love texts based on an original. So this again is two male characters from Attack on Titan, like boys' love-ified in a fan comic. And some people like to take their cosplay more from the fan transformative work than from the original. There we go. There's some more Attack on Titan. Boys love cosplay. And eventually, we get far from the idea of the original work, so that the original itself loses some of its cultural capital, and the fan work takes precedence for the cosplayer, because the content and the visuals are maybe more appealing to them than the original. So this is a cosplay based on a boys love fan art of Attack on Titan. So the original text is it kind of gets lost here, and we see this in fandom more and more and more. It crosses over so many times that the original almost is not important anymore. But also we can say that the gender identity of the cosplayers also impacts the sexual orientation of the boys love performance, and it makes it kind of complicated to try and figure out what type of relationship is being performed here. So probably the most common within Japan is boys love cosplay scenes with two female cosplayers, because there are more female cosplayers. So when you have two women like this performing a romantic or an erotic scene or image, what are we looking at? Are we looking at boys love because it's intended to be a boys love scenario? Or if we go back to the embodied idea and we look at the bodies of the cosplayers, are we actually, what we are looking at is kind of female homoeroticism? And it's never really, generally the cosplayers themselves, they don't really comment on that aspect of it. And so it's really ambiguous, and the kind of potential sexualities within the image become multiplied. Or we can have a male cosplayer and a female cosplayer, and then is it a boys love performance, or is it a straight performance? And we could have two male cosplayers. These are quite popular Chinese cosplayers. So then is this boys love? And boys love is very specifically female fan oriented. There are male boys love fans, but it's aimed at women. So is it this very highly romanticized and almost feminized version of male sexuality? Or is it male homoeroticism that's somehow more gay man oriented? And then we can go further, and here we kind of go out of Japan in my examples because I couldn't find any Japanese examples. We're going back, I think we're going to Russia this time. So these are really popular cosplayers within the Attack on Titan cosplay community, and we have one male cosplayer and one cosplayer who is non-gender specific. So this person has never revealed their gender identity, and in fact they make a point of not revealing it. So first of all, what kind of gender performance are we looking at? Is this crossplay? Is this person performing a male character because it kind of looks like a woman, but we don't know? Is it trans cosplay? Perhaps. And then what are we looking at? Is it boys love? Is it straight? Is it male homoeroticism? Is it something else? So boys love in particular, and it's not only boys love that's connected with cosplay, but boys love in particular makes the gender performance more complex and takes it to a whole level where you are questioning the kind of what would seem to be a simple male homoerotic performance, and makes it much more difficult to define. So, alright, so the close connection between cosplay and boys love, it renders this idea of stable gender or stable sexual categories problematic. And within the cosplay community, it's not necessarily questioned by the cosplayers themselves, but meaning is made by the observers. So, and I would say that's true for most media studies, cultural studies, film studies, etc. Whatever the intent of the cosplayer was, meaningfulness is created by the observer of the image or of the performance. So it shows how easily the categories of male, female, straight, gay, something else, can be kind of disrupted and confused by multi-layered performances and kind of multimodal fandom. So there's so much more exciting things to say about boys love that would inform this lecture, but Professor Nozawa is going to talk about that much more deeply. But the key point I want to make that when you're studying fan cultures, it's really valuable to take a holistic, like not a narrow look, but a holistic look across multiple media and practices, because their overlaps reveal kind of a much more complex engagement of fans with identity than if we isolate ourselves to one narrow area of fandom. Okay, so I have no idea how long I've been going, but I'm going to conclude. So, as I said at the beginning, Japanese pop culture and fandoms, they've spread within Asia, they've spread beyond Asia, including cosplay. And fans in different regions adapt cosplay and boys love for their own specific purposes. They all share some points, but they really use it for their own kind of ends as well. So I'll talk about only a couple of examples from within Asia. So in some South Asian countries like Malaysia and also India, for them, boys love and cosplay, especially boys love cosplay, becomes a safe space in which women can envisage sexual desire and perform sexual desire without involving a body that is designated female. So women are not supposed to have desire, and women's bodies are not supposed to be sexual, at least from, like women are not supposed to think of them as sexual. But by looking at boys love scenarios, you can experiment with desire, but there's not a female body involved, so it feels safer. In South Korea, boys love cosplay has a very close connection with K-pop fandom, understandably, especially male idols. And Korean fans, they were kind of criticized in the same way that Japanese fans of BL have been for not being engaged with real LGBTQ issues, for using these male-male kind of sexual fantasies completely disconnected with gender politics, sexual politics, and real lives of LGBT people. But in recent years, Korean fans have kind of taken this on board, and they're starting to try and engage more and more with these real life issues. And in China, boys love images and also kind of crossplay and cosplay. It's not only used as a commentary on the repression of alternative sexualities, women's sexuality, gay sexuality, but also on politics. And if you take a look at boys love and that kind of cosplay within China, you can find some very interesting images of Chinese politicians in quite compromising images, which are very beautifully drawn in boys love style, and to show kind of problematic connections between various political parties and things like that. Alright, so I don't want to forget Europe, because here we are. So European countries, of course, have their own cosplay cultures, and I know that in terms of Japanese pop culture, as well as like France and Germany, Spain has huge fandom, huge market for Japanese pop culture, and you will know way more about that than me. So you probably know more about the specific features of Spanish fandom. They also share some key similarities with Japanese fan cultures, some of which we've discussed. So by comparing fan cultures, not only in terms of fan media and fan practices, but also transnationally, we can more clearly see not only the gender and sexual issues that are unique to each society, but which of the pressing problems regarding identity transcend national borders and concern us all. And so I hope that if you have an interest in any kind of fan culture, you'll think about taking a look at it in this kind of holistic way. I think you'll find some really interesting points. Okay, so I have a couple of references. If you're interested, feel free to ask me afterwards. I can give them to you to take a look at. They're all about cosplay and gender. And yeah, thank you very much.